The wagon wheels ground to a halt against the red sandstone, splintering wood against unforgiving rock. Margaret Whitmore felt the jolt through her bones as the axle cracked with a sound like breaking thunder. Dust settled around them in the suffocating heat of the Arizona Territory, and for the first time in 3 days of travel, silence fell complete and absolute. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 faces turned toward her from beneath the torn canvas cover. Sarah, nearly 16, with her father's stubborn jaw and eyes that had aged beyond their years. The twins, Rebecca and Rachel, 11 years old and inseparable as shadows there. Matching braids, now dusty and tangled. David, 9, clutching a wooden horse his father had carved before the fever took him. Little Thomas, 7, whose cough had worsened with each mile. And baby Emma, barely 3, sleeping fitfully in Sarah's arms despite the heat and chaos. Margaret stepped down from the driver's seat, her boots sinking into sand that seemed to swallow sound itself. The broken wheel lay twisted against the canyon wall, iron rim bent beyond any hope of repair. Around them rose walls of layered stone, carved by wind and water into impossible shapes, stretching up toward a narrow ribbon of sky, so blue it hurt to look at directly. They had been traveling for 6 weeks, following the promise of her late husband's brother in California. "Come west," his letter had urged. "There's work here, land for those willing to claim it, a fresh start for you and the children." The journey from Missouri had been harder than she'd imagined. Disease at the river crossings, storms that lasted days, the constant fear of running short on supplies, but they had pressed on, driven by the knowledge that nothing waited for them back home except debt and the charity of neighbors who had already given more than they could spare. Now, in this maze of red stone under the merciless sun, that hope felt as broken as their wagon wheel. Margaret had studied the hand-drawn map the trading post owner had sketched for her back in Tucson. "Follow the main canyon east for 2 days," he'd said, scratching lines with a stub of pencil. "When you reach the fork where 3 paths meet, take the middle route. It'll lead you through to the valley beyond. From there, it's straight desert. Travel to the California border." Simple enough when spoken aloud in the shade of a trading post, with cool water and hot coffee within reach. Here, surrounded by towering walls that cast shadows in patterns she couldn't read, with the sun climbing toward its brutal noon peak, those directions seemed as useless as smoke. The children climbed down from the wagon, their movements slow and careful. Sarah immediately went to work organizing their remaining supplies, her efficiency masking the fear Margaret could see in the set of her shoulders. The twins began gathering the scattered belongings that had spilled when the wheel broke, working with the quiet coordination they'd developed during their long journey. David sat on a rock, still holding his wooden horse, staring up at the canyon walls with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Thomas began coughing again, deep, racking sounds that echoed off the stone. Margaret knelt beside him, feeling his forehead, still burning with fever, despite the willow bark tea she'd been forcing down him for the past 2 days. The desert heat would only make it worse. She looked around at their situation with growing desperation. 2 barrels of water, enough food for perhaps a week if they stretched it carefully, and 6 children, depending on her to somehow find their way out of this stone labyrinth. The canyon stretched in 3 directions from where they'd stopped. Behind them, the way they'd come, winding back toward Tucson and civilization. To the left, a narrow passage that seemed to curve away into darkness between high walls. To the right, a broader path that climbed steadily upward, disappearing around a bend. None of them matched the middle route she was supposed to take. Margaret walked to each opening, studying the ground for wheel ruts or horse tracks, any sign that other travelers had passed this way. The sand at the mouth of each passage lay smooth and unmarked, swept clean by wind that never seemed to stop moving through these stone corridors. She tried to remember the landmarks the trading post owner had mentioned, a rock formation shaped like a church steeple, a spring marked by cottonwood trees, an ancient Indian dwelling carved into the cliff face. She saw none of these things. Sarah approached, carrying Emma on her hip. "Ma," she said quietly, using the shortened name she'd adopted since their father's death, as if full words required. Too much energy to spare. "The water barrels are nearly empty. I've been rationing, but—" Margaret nodded, understanding without explanation. With Thomas burning with fever, they couldn't reduce his water any further. The other children had been uncomplaining about their thirst, but she'd seen how they looked at the water barrel when they thought she wasn't watching. "How far do you think we've come from the main route?" Sarah asked. Margaret considered this. They'd been traveling since dawn, following what had seemed like the most logical path eastward, but these canyons twisted and branched in ways that defied simple direction. A passage that started heading east might curve north or south, or even double back on itself before you realized what had happened. She'd tried to keep track by watching the sun's position, but the high walls blocked her view for hours at a time. "I don't know," she admitted. It was the first time she'd spoken those words aloud since beginning this journey, and they tasted like defeat. David had climbed onto a boulder and was peering down each of the 3 passages. "Ma, there's something carved in the rock over here," he called out. Margaret and Sarah hurried to where he stood. Scratched into the sandstone, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were symbols that meant nothing to her. Lines and circles, arranged in patterns that suggested meaning without revealing it. Indian markings, perhaps, but from which tribe and saying what she couldn't guess. The afternoon heat was beginning to build, turning the canyon into an oven of reflected sunlight and trapped air. They needed shelter, water, and a way out of this maze. But more immediately, they needed to make a decision about which direction to take. Sarah had inherited her father's practical mind. She began laying out their situation with the methodical approach of someone much older than her 16 years. "We have enough water for 2 days, maybe 3 if we're careful with Thomas. Food for a week. The horses are tired, but they can, and pull the wagon if we can fix the wheel somehow." "How do we fix a broken axle?" Rebecca asked. She and her twin had been listening from where they sat in the wagon's shade, but now they approached the family conference with expressions of worried determination. "We don't," Margaret said. "We'll have to pack what we can carry and leave the wagon." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. The wagon contained everything they owned, furniture that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother, clothes. For the children, tools and household goods they'd need to start their new life in California. But more than that, it was their last physical connection to the home they'd left behind. Thomas began coughing again, harder this time. Margaret gathered him in her arms, feeling how light he'd become during their weeks of travel. The fever had stolen his appetite along with his strength, and she'd watched him grow thinner each day, despite her efforts to tempt him with what food they had. "Which way, Ma?" Sarah asked quietly. Margaret looked at each passage again, trying to read some sign in the rock, the sand, the quality of light and shadow. The left passage felt cooler, suggesting it might lead toward water. The right passage climbed upward, which might offer a view of the surrounding country. The way behind them led back towards safety, but also toward the life they'd fled. Emma woke in Sarah's arms and began to fuss, her small voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The sound seemed to emphasize their isolation, trapped between walls of stone with no clear path forward and no easy way back. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the heated rock. Margaret watched it bank and turn, effortlessly navigating the maze of canyons that had confounded her completely. If only she could see as that bird saw, looking down at the pattern of passages and understanding how they connected. The decision couldn't be delayed much longer. The sun was climbing toward its peak, and they needed to find shelter before the full heat of the day made travel impossible. More importantly, they needed to find water before their supplies ran out entirely. Margaret began gathering the most essential items from the wagon: blankets, food, the remaining water, medical supplies for Thomas. Sarah helped her pack everything into bundles they could carry, making the hard choices about what to leave behind. The children watched in silence, understanding that they were witnessing the end of one phase of their journey and the beginning of something much more uncertain. As they prepared to abandon the wagon and continue on foot, Margaret found herself thinking of her husband's stories about the early settlers who had crossed these same lands. Men and women who had faced impossible odds and somehow found their way through wilderness that had claimed countless others. She tried to draw strength from those tales, to believe that determination and faith might be enough to see them safely through this stone maze. But as she looked at her 6 children, ranging from Sarah's capable 16 years down to little Emma's helpless 3, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every choice she made from this point forward would determine whether they found their way to safety or joined the bones that, according to the stories, whitened in hidden corners of these endless canyons. Thomas leaned against her, his small body radiating heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Time was running out, and she still had no idea which direction might lead them home. Margaret chose the left passage. The decision came not from wisdom, but from desperation. Thomas needed cooler air, and the narrow corridor promised shade. They moved single file between walls that seemed to close tighter with each step, Sarah leading with Emma on her back, the twins following with their salvaged bundles, David and Thomas holding Margaret's hands as she brought up the rear. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended deeper into the canyon's throat. Here, sunlight penetrated only in thin shafts that painted golden stripes across the red stone. Their footsteps echoed differently, muffled yet amplified by the confined space. Margaret began to hope they'd chosen correctly when the passage suddenly opened into a circular chamber carved by ancient waters, and there, sitting cross-legged beside a pool of spring water, was a man. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He didn't move when they entered, didn't acknowledge their presence beyond a slight shift in his gaze. He was Apache. That much was clear from his clothing and the way he wore his long black hair. But everything else about him challenged Margaret's expectations. His shirt was cotton, worn but clean. His boots were cavalry issued, though he wore no uniform. Most surprising of all, he was reading a book. Sarah instinctively pulled the children behind her, but Margaret stepped forward. Water meant survival, and this man sat beside the only source they'd seen in hours. "Excuse me," she began, her voice cracking from thirst and uncertainty. He looked up then, and Margaret found herself staring into eyes that held no hostility, only a careful intelligence that seemed to take in everything about their desperate situation in a single glance. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with high cheekbones and skin weathered by desert sun. When he spoke, his English carried only the faintest trace of accent. "You're lost." It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded anyway, suddenly, aware of how they must appear, dusty, exhausted, clearly out of place in this wilderness. "My children need water," she said, gesturing toward Thomas, who had begun coughing again. The man closed his book and set it aside. Margaret caught a glimpse of the cover, something about geology and mineral formations. He rose in one fluid motion and stepped away from the spring. drink," he said simply. Margaret hesitated. In all the stories she'd heard about Indians, none had prepared her for this quiet courtesy. But Thomas was burning with fever, and the spring water looked clear and cool. She knelt beside the pool and cupped water in her hands, tasting it first. It was sweet, without the alkaline bite that plagued so many desert springs. She called the children forward, and they drank gratefully, even baby Emma accepting water from Margaret's cupped palms. As they drank, Margaret studied their unexpected companion. He watched them with the same careful attention she'd noticed before, but showed no sign of impatience or territorial concern. When Thomas began coughing again, the man reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something. "Willow bark," he said, offering Margaret a strip of dried inner bark. "For the fever." She accepted it cautiously. "You speak English very well." "I should. I went to school in Carlisle for 6 years." He said it matter-of-factly, without pride or bitterness. "My name is Joseph Running Bear, though the army knew me as Joe Benson." The casual mention of the army explained the boots and the bearing. Margaret had heard of Indians who served as scouts for the cavalry, though she'd never expected to meet one in circumstances like these. "I'm Margaret Whitmore," she replied. "These are my children. We're trying to reach California, but—" She gestured helplessly at their surroundings. "But you took the wrong fork 3 canyons back," Joseph finished. "You're now approximately 12 miles south of the main route, in a section the Mexicans call El Laberinto del Diablo." "The Devil's Labyrinth," Sarah translated quietly. She'd been studying Spanish in preparation for their new life. Joseph nodded approvingly. "You have education. That's good. You'll need it where you're going." He paused, studying Thomas, who had curled up beside the spring and fallen into an exhausted sleep. "The boy needs rest, not travel. And this maze has 17 different passages. 14 of them lead deeper into dead ends or circle back on themselves." Margaret felt her heart sink. 17 passages. The Tohono O'odham have used this place for ceremonies for over 1,000 years. Every path has meaning, but only 3 lead to water, and only 1 leads out toward your destination. Joseph gestured toward the book he'd set aside. "I've been mapping these canyons for the Geological Survey. 3 years of work, and I still discover new passages." The twins had finished drinking and were examining the petroglyphs carved into the chamber walls. Rebecca traced one with her finger, a spiral that seemed to move in the flickering light. "What do they mean?" she asked Joseph. "Stories, directions, warnings." He approached the wall and pointed to a series of interconnected circles. "This one tells of a great flood that carved these canyons. This one," he indicated a pattern of zigzag lines, "marks the path to the sacred spring." "Are there other springs?" Margaret asked hopefully. 2 others within a day's walk, but one is contaminated with alkali, and the other requires climbing. Skills your family doesn't possess." Joseph's assessment was clinical, not unkind. "This is the only reliable water source in the southern section," as if to emphasize their predicament. The late afternoon light began to fade in the chamber. Margaret realized they would need to spend the night here, whether Joseph welcomed their presence or not. "We don't want to intrude," she began carefully. "The spring belongs to no one and everyone," Joseph replied. "But you should know that you're not the first family to become lost in these canyons. Last year, I found the remains of a party from New Mexico. This year, a group of miners who thought they could shortcut to the Colorado River." The implication hung heavy in the cooling air. Margaret felt Sarah move closer to her, understanding the gravity of their situation, even if the younger children didn't. "Is there a way out?" Margaret asked directly. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dimming light. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision. "There are 3 ways out. The first requires backtracking to where you made the wrong turn, then following the correct route. That would take 4 days of hard travel, and you don't have enough water. Margaret's heart sank further. The second is a shortcut the Apache sometimes use. It involves climbing and narrow ledges, possible for experienced travelers, but not for children. And the third, Sarah asked when Joseph paused. The third requires a guide who knows these canyons intimately, someone who can lead you by paths that don't appear on any white man's map. Margaret understood what he was suggesting, but couldn't bring herself to ask directly. The idea of trusting their lives to a stranger, regardless of his apparent kindness, seemed impossible, yet the alternatives he'd outlined offered little hope. As full darkness settled over the canyon, Joseph built a small fire using wood he'd apparently gathered earlier. The flames danced against the stone walls, creating shadows that transformed the petroglyphs into moving stories. He shared his simple meal with them, jerked meat, cornbread, and coffee that tasted better than anything Margaret had drunk in weeks. Thomas's fever broke during the night, his small body finally cooled to the touch for the first time in days. Margaret woke to find Joseph sitting beside the dying fire, studying a hand-drawn map covered with notations in both English and what she assumed was Apache script. "Your son will recover," he said quietly, not looking up from his work. "The altitude here helps with lung sickness, but he needs several days of rest before attempting serious travel." Margaret sat up, careful not to disturb the sleeping children. "We can't impose on your hospitality for days." "It's not my hospitality. It's the canyons." Joseph folded the map and looked at her directly. "But you should understand what you're asking of this place. These stones have swallowed stronger parties than yours." In the firelight, his face showed neither judgment nor pity, only the careful assessment of someone who understood survival, in ways she was just beginning to grasp. "Why are you helping us?" she asked him. Joseph added another piece of wood to the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the narrow opening above. "Because I know what it's like to be caught between worlds, following a path that might not lead where you expect." "The army? The army? The white man's school? The space between what I was born to be and what I was trained to become." He gestured toward his geological survey book. "I mapped these canyons for the government, but I learned to read them from my grandfather. 2 different kinds of knowledge, not always compatible." Margaret sensed depths in his answer that went far beyond their immediate situation. She thought of her own journey, leaving everything familiar behind in search of a future that remained largely imaginary. "If you guided us out," she said carefully, "what would you want in return?" Joseph smiled then, the first time she'd seen any warmth in his expression. "There's a geological survey station in Flagstaff. I need to deliver my reports there before the end of summer. California is on my way." The offer hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Margaret looked at her sleeping children, at Thomas finally resting peacefully, at the impossible maze of stone that surrounded them. She thought of the broken wagon, the dwindling supplies, the dozens of wrong turns that might still await them. When she looked back at Joseph, he was studying his map again, giving her space to make a decision that would determine whether her family lived or died in this beautiful, merciless wilderness. The fire burned lower, and somewhere in the darkness above, a night-bird called out with a sound like distant music, as if the canyon itself was singing them toward sleep. Dawn came, differently in the deep canyons. The walls blocked direct sunlight until well past sunrise, creating a twilight world where shadows moved like living things across the stone. Margaret woke to the sound of water trickling and found Joseph kneeling beside the spring, washing what appeared to be surveying instruments with careful precision. "Your equipment," she observed, approaching quietly so as not to wake the children. "Transit and compass, measuring chains, specimen bags." He held up a brass instrument that caught the filtered morning light, The government wants detailed maps of every canyon, every mineral deposit, every water source between here and the Colorado River. Margaret studied the collection of tools and notebooks arranged on a flat rock. That's how you know so much about these passages. Partly, but mostly I know them because my grandfather brought me here as a boy. Before the army, before Carlisle, before I learned to see this place through white men's eyes. Joseph dried the transit with a soft cloth, his movements economical and practiced. He taught me that every canyon has a voice, if you know how to. Listen, what do they say? The question came from Sarah, who had awakened and approached them with Emma on her hip. Joseph looked at her appraisingly. This one speaks of patience. It was carved by water that took 10,000 years to cut through. Solid stone. Quick travelers die here. Patient ones find what they need. Emma reached toward the shiny instruments with curious fingers, and Joseph surprised Margaret by offering the child a small brass measuring tool to examine. "Your sister has good eyes," he told Sarah. "She notices details." As the other children stirred awake, Joseph began preparing breakfast with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to camp life. But unlike the previous evening's simple meal, this morning he produced supplies that spoke of careful planning: eggs wrapped in cloth, bacon, even fresh flour for biscuits. "You weren't planning to stay in this canyon," Margaret realized. "No, I was mapping the northern passages when I heard your wagon break yesterday." Joseph arranged kindling for a cooking fire. "Sound travels strangely here. I followed the noise to see what had gone wrong." Thomas sat up, his face pale but no longer flushed with fever. "Are we still lost?" he asked in a small voice. "Lost is when you don't know where you are," Joseph replied, cracking eggs into a pan. "You're in the heart of sacred ground, beside sweet water, with shelter from wind and rain. Some would say you're exactly where you need to be." The twins emerged from their blankets and immediately began exploring the chamber's walls, fascinated by the petroglyphs that seemed to glow in the morning light. David joined them, still clutching his wooden horse, but showing more energy than he'd displayed in days. "Mr. Running Bear," Rebecca called out, "this picture looks like our horses." Joseph left his cooking to examine the petroglyph she'd found. It showed a series of animals in profile, clearly recognizable as horses, despite the stylized ancient artwork. "Impossible," he said quietly. "Horses came with the Spanish, less than 400 years ago. These markings are much older." "Maybe they're not horses," Rachel suggested. "Maybe they're something else that looks like horses." Joseph knelt to their level, studying the petroglyphs with renewed interest. What else could they be? The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications. Then Rebecca spoke for both. Dreams of horses, pictures of what someone hoped to see someday. The simplicity of the child's observation seemed to affect Joseph profoundly. He traced the carved animals with one finger, his expression thoughtful. "My grandfather told stories of the ancient ones who lived here before any of our peoples arrived. He said they could see across time, forward and backward, like looking through clear water." Joseph stood slowly. Perhaps they drew what they saw coming. Breakfast passed in comfortable conversation, with Joseph answering the children's endless questions about the canyon's formation, the meaning of various petroglyphs, and the habits of the desert animals whose tracks they'd noticed in the sand. His knowledge seemed encyclopedic, encompassing both scientific observation and traditional oral history. But Margaret noticed that he consistently deflected personal questions. When David asked about his family, Joseph pointed out a lizard sunning itself on the rocks. When Sarah inquired about his time at Carlisle, he began explaining the geological forces that had created the spring. As they finished eating, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. "If we accept your offer to guide us out," she said, "what would that journey look like?" Joseph set down his coffee cup and unfolded his detailed map. 3 options: as I mentioned. But if we take the traditional Apache route, we follow paths that require precise timing and careful attention to weather. He traced a line with his finger that seemed to loop back on itself in impossible ways. We travel only in early morning and late afternoon, rest during the heat of midday, follow water sources that don't appear on government maps, stop at places where the old ones left markers for travelers. "How long?" Sarah asked. 2 weeks to reach the main California trail. But we move as the desert allows, not as impatience demands. Joseph looked directly at Margaret. "Your son needs time to regain his strength. The little one needs to adjust to the elevation changes we'll encounter. And all of you need to learn to read this country before it tests you seriously." Margaret felt a chill despite the warming air. "Tests us how?" "Flash floods that can fill a dry canyon in minutes. Temperature swings that can freeze water at night and boil it by noon. Animals that mistake children for prey. Plants that can kill you if you mistake them for food." Joseph's catalogue was matter-of-fact, without drama or exaggeration. "This isn't farmland in Missouri. Everything here is designed to survive in conditions that would kill most travelers." Thomas began coughing again, reminding them all of their vulnerability. Joseph reached into his medical supplies and produced a different bark preparation. "Osha root," he explained, preparing a tea. "Stronger than willow bark for lung troubles, but it must be used carefully." As he worked, Margaret found herself studying this unexpected guide. His movements combined the precision of military training with something older and more intuitive. When he listened to Thomas's breathing, he seemed to hear things beyond the simple sounds of congestion. "You're not just a scout," she realized. "You know medicine. Traditional healing was part of my grandfather's teaching. Army field medicine was part of my training. Sometimes they complement each other." Joseph handed the prepared tea to Thomas. "Drink it slowly. It's bitter, but effective." The morning advanced, and with it came decisions that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Their abandoned wagon sat miles away, its contents growing more irrelevant with each passing hour. The safe route back to civilization led through territory they lacked the supplies to cross. The shortcut routes offered speed at the cost of dangers they weren't equipped to handle. But accepting Joseph's guidance meant trusting their lives to a man they'd known for less than 24 hours, following paths that existed nowhere on official maps, relying on knowledge that bridged worlds Margaret barely understood. As she watched her children exploring the chamber with growing confidence, their fear gradually replaced by curiosity about their surroundings, Margaret began to understand that this decision would shape more than just their immediate survival. They were choosing between the familiar dangers of known routes and the uncertain promises of a path that might transform them all. Joseph seemed to sense her internal struggle. Without speaking, he handed her his geological survey notebook, opened to a page covered with detailed sketches of canyon formations and careful annotations about water sources, seasonal variations, and animal migration patterns. "Knowledge belongs to whoever needs it most," he said simply, "but wisdom belongs to whoever earned it through experience." Margaret studied the precise drawings, the careful measurements, the integration of scientific observation with traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Here was a man who belonged fully to neither world, but had created something valuable from the intersection of both. Outside the chamber, the desert was beginning its daily transformation from the cool refuge of dawn to the demanding furnace of midday. Soon they would need to seek deeper shade, to wait out the hours when travel became impossible. But first, they needed to choose their path forward. Margaret's answer came not in words, but in action. She began repacking their belongings, this time following Joseph's quiet suggestions about weight distribution and essential items. The children watched as she made hard choices, leaving behind Her grandmother's china plates, but keeping the medical supplies, abandoning a trunk of winter clothes, but saving the tools that might prove useful in unknown territory. Joseph observed without comment until she hesitated over a leather-bound Bible, worn smooth by years of handling. "Faith weighs nothing," he said simply, "and some burdens become lighter the farther you carry them." The book went into Sarah's pack. Their first lesson in desert travel came before they'd walked 100 yards from the sacred spring. Joseph stopped the small procession and knelt beside what appeared to be empty sand. "What do you see?" he asked the children. They gathered around, studying the ground with the intense concentration of students facing an important test. David was first to spot something, scratches in the sand, like something was dragged. "Good eyes," Joseph approved. "What else?" Rebecca crouched lower, her face nearly touching the earth. "Little holes. In a line." "Excellent. You're looking at the track of a sidewinder rattlesnake, probably made just before dawn." Joseph traced the distinctive pattern with his finger. "See how the scratches angle to the left? That tells us the wind direction this morning, the depth of the impressions. It tells us the snake size. The spacing tells us whether it was hunting or just traveling." Thomas, still weak but determined to keep up, raised his hand like he was in school. "How do we not step on it?" "We don't avoid the snake," Joseph replied, standing and brushing sand from his knees. "We read the story it tells us. This track is 4 hours old, leading toward that shaded overhang where snakes rest during the day. So we know to be careful near rocks and shadows, and we know there's at least one large rattler in this area." They resumed walking, but now the children's attention focused on the ground with new intensity. Every mark in the sand became a potential message, every disturbance a story waiting to be read. The passage Joseph led them through defied every expectation Margaret had formed about desert travel. Instead of crossing open country under the punishing sun, they moved through a network of connected canyons, where walls provided constant shade and hidden springs offered regular water. The path twisted and doubled back on itself in ways that would have been impossible to follow without a guide who knew every turn, but the route demanded its own form of payment. The first challenge came at a place Joseph called the Needle's Eye, a gap in the canyon wall so narrow that adults had to turn sideways to pass through. The opening stretched for nearly 50 feet, with walls that pressed close enough to touch on both sides. "This is where we learn to trust the rock," Joseph explained, demonstrating how to move through the passage. "Don't fight the space, let it guide you." Sarah went first, carrying Emma and talking softly to keep the toddler calm in the confined space. The twins followed hand in hand, their matching braids catching on the rough stone. David hesitated at the entrance, his wooden horse clutched tight against his chest. "What if I get stuck?" he whispered. Joseph knelt beside the boy. "Then we make you smaller, or make the space bigger. But that won't happen if you move like water, not like a tree." Margaret didn't understand the comparison until she entered the passage herself. Fighting the narrow space created panic and clumsiness. Accepting it, moving with fluid patience, allowed her body to find its way through openings that seemed impossibly tight. Thomas struggled most, his weakened condition making the sustained sideways movement exhausting. Halfway through he began to wheeze and had to stop, pressing his back against one wall while his breathing gradually steadied. "The rock remembers everyone who passes through," Joseph told him, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "It knows you belong here because you're brave enough to try." When they emerged on the far side, the children wore expressions of accomplishment that transformed their faces. They had passed their first real test of the desert, learning to work with the land rather than against it. But Joseph's teaching had only begun. At their midday rest stop, a circular chamber where ancient floodwaters had carved smooth bowls. In the stone, He produced a collection of items that looked like random desert debris. "Survival lesson," he announced, laying out pieces of dry wood, fragments of stone, strips of plant fiber, and what appeared to be ordinary sand. "You're going to make fire without matches," he continued, "and find water where there appears to be none." The children exchanged glances that mixed excitement with skepticism. Making fire was something they'd read about in adventure stories, not something they'd ever attempted themselves. Joseph began with the wood, showing them how to identify pieces that would create the right friction for fire starting. Not all dry wood works. You need the right hardness, the right grain, wood that's been seasoned by sun and wind in just the right way. He demonstrated the technique with movements that looked deceptively simple. A pointed stick rotated rapidly against a flat piece of wood, creating friction that produced first smoke, then glowing ember, finally flame when fed with carefully prepared tinder. "Your turn," he said, handing the fire-making kit to Sarah. What had looked effortless when Joseph did it proved maddening when attempted by inexperienced hands. Sarah's first attempts produced nothing but sore palms and frustrated sighs. The twins tried working together, one holding the base steady while the other rotated the spindle, but their coordination wavered under pressure. David approached the challenge with scientific determination, studying the angle of Joseph's hands, the rhythm of his movements, the precise moment when smoke began to form. His efforts came closer to success, producing wisps of smoke that dissipated before catching flame. Thomas, despite his weakened condition, surprised everyone by achieving the steadiest motion. His illness had taught him patience that the others lacked, and he worked the firebow with quiet persistence until actual smoke began to rise from the tinder. "Help him," Joseph instructed Margaret, and together they nursed Thomas's ember into actual flame. The triumph on the boy's face was worth every frustrating attempt that had preceded it. The water lesson proved even more challenging. Joseph led them to what appeared to be solid rock, pointing to subtle discolorations in the stone. "Water seeps through sandstone," he explained, "but you have to know how to find it and how to collect it." He showed them how to identify the mineral stains that indicated moisture, how to position collecting cloths to capture condensation, how to dig small wells in sandy spots where water might accumulate underground. But the most important lesson was about patience. "Desert water doesn't come quickly," Joseph said, as they set up their collection system. "You prepare everything correctly, then wait for the stone to give you what it can." While they waited for water to collect, Joseph taught them to read the more subtle signs of their environment. The direction morning shadows fell, indicating east without consulting the sun. The types of plants that grew near reliable water sources. The calls of different birds and what they revealed about time of day, weather changes, and potential dangers. Rebecca proved especially gifted at interpreting animal signs. She spotted the tracks of a kit fox, identified the scratchings where a roadrunner had hunted for insects, and correctly predicted that a circling hawk meant small prey animals were active nearby. "You have hunter's eyes," Joseph told her, and the girl glowed with pride. But their lessons were interrupted by the first real test of their trust in their guide. The afternoon had grown late when Joseph suddenly stopped the group and raised his hand for silence. His head tilted as if listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. In the profound quiet of the canyon, even whispered sounds carried far, but she heard nothing except the soft whisper of wind through stone passages. Joseph's expression changed, becoming alert in a way that transformed his entire bearing. Without explanation, he began moving quickly toward a side passage Margaret hadn't even noticed, gesturing for them to follow. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. "Flash flood," Joseph replied tersely. "We have maybe 10 minutes." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd heard stories of desert floods that appeared without warning, walls of water that swept away everything in narrow canyons, but the sky above showed no sign of rain, no threat of storm. "How can you know?" she asked, even as she hurried the children toward the shelter Joseph had chosen. "Sound travels through stone before water does," he explained, helping Thomas climb over a boulder. "The vibration reaches your feet before the flood reaches your eyes." Now that he'd pointed it out, Margaret thought she could feel something. A barely perceptible trembling in the rock beneath her boots, so subtle it might have been imagination. They reached higher ground, just as the first trickle of muddy water appeared in the passage they'd been following. Within minutes, that trickle became a stream, then a torrent that filled the canyon floor with churning brown water carrying debris. From distant rainstorms, the children watched in fascinated terror as logs, branches, and what might have been parts of someone else's wagon swept past in the roiling current. The water rose with terrifying speed, reaching heights that would have swept them away if they'd been caught in the passage. "How often does this happen?" Margaret asked, her voice barely steady. "Often enough," Joseph replied, his attention focused on the flood's behavior. "Storm 50 miles north can send water through these canyons hours later. It's why the old ones built their sacred places above the flood line. The flood lasted less than an hour, but its passage transformed the landscape. Sand patterns they'd been following were erased. Landmarks Joseph had pointed out were buried under fresh debris. The familiar became foreign in the space of a single afternoon. When the water finally receded, leaving only scattered pools and mud-caked stones, Joseph led them down to examine what the flood had revealed. In one protected alcove, the rushing water had uncovered what appeared to be pottery fragments and flint tools, artifacts of peoples who had faced similar challenges in this same landscape centuries before. "The desert gives and takes," Joseph said, allowing the children to examine the ancient artifacts. "But it always leaves lessons for those who know how to read them." As evening approached, and they made camp in a sheltered chamber well above any impossible flood line, Margaret found herself looking at her guide with new understanding. His knowledge hadn't come from books or military training alone. It represented generations of accumulated wisdom about survival in a landscape that demanded both respect and constant vigilance. That night, as they shared a meal around a fire, the children had built themselves using Joseph's techniques. Margaret realized they were no longer simply following a guide through dangerous territory. They were becoming students of a way of life that required skills her previous existence had never demanded. The desert was teaching them, through Joseph's patient instruction, to see themselves differently, not as visitors passing through hostile territory, but as travelers learning to read the complex language of stone and sky, water and wind. But tomorrow would bring new tests, and Margaret suspected the lessons would only become more demanding. As they ventured deeper into the country, where their old assumptions about safety and certainty would be challenged by realities they were only beginning to understand. The 5th day of their journey brought Margaret face to face with a truth she'd been avoiding. They were no longer the same family that had left Missouri 3 months earlier, broken and desperate for a new start. The desert was remaking them day by careful day into something she didn't yet recognize. It started with Emma's laughter. The toddler had been silent for most of their travels, clinging to Sarah with the desperate quiet of a child who had learned that noise brought unwelcome attention. But that morning, as they prepared to leave their sheltered camp, Emma spotted a roadrunner performing its elaborate mating dance near their fire pit. The bird strutted and preened, tail feathers spread in a magnificent display, completely oblivious to its human audience. Emma giggled, a sound so unexpected that everyone stopped what they were doing to stare at her. "Bird," she said clearly, pointing at the roadrunner. "Funny bird." It was the first word she'd spoken since they'd entered the canyons. Joseph smiled, an expression that transformed his usually serious face. "She's learning desert language," he told Margaret. "Children adapt faster than adults because they don't. Carry assumptions about how things should be." Margaret watched her youngest daughter study the Roadrunner with intense concentration, then attempt her own version of the bird's strutting walk. The sight filled her with an emotion she couldn't quite name, part relief, part terror at how quickly her children were changing. But Emma's breakthrough was only the beginning of a day that would test every lesson they'd learned about trust. In survival, the passage Joseph chose that morning led steadily upward, following what he called the grandfather's stairway, a series of natural rock formations that climbed toward the canyon rim like enormous stone steps. Each level required increasingly complex navigation, demanding skills the family had been gradually developing over their days of desert travel. "Why do we go up?" David asked, pausing to catch his breath on a particularly steep section. "Wouldn't it be easier to stay in the canyon bottoms?" Joseph pointed toward the distant mountains, barely visible as purple shadows on the horizon. "Because easy paths don't always lead where you need to go. We climb to see the country ahead, to understand our choices before we make them." The ascent challenged each family member differently. Sarah, carrying Emma and much of their water supply, had to stop frequently to rest. The twins, who had become inseparable during their desert travels, worked together to navigate sections where handholds were scarce. Thomas, still recovering from his fever, moved with careful determination that belied his small size, but it was Margaret who struggled most with the exposure. Heights had never bothered her before, but the combination of narrow ledges, sheer drops, and the responsibility for 6 young lives created a paralyzing anxiety she fought to conceal. Joseph noticed, as he seemed to notice everything. Without drawing attention to her difficulty, he began positioning himself between Margaret and the worst exposures, offering quiet guidance about foot placement and balance. "The stone is solid," he reminded her during one particularly challenging traverse. "Trust what you can feel beneath your feet, not what your eyes tell you about the distance below." At the 3rd level of the climb, they encountered their first human observers since leaving the sacred spring. A group of Tohono O'odham travelers had stopped at a traditional rest site, their horses laden with trade goods, heading toward the Mexican settlements to the south. The encounter began with careful formality. Joseph approached the group alone, speaking in a language Margaret didn't recognize. The conversation continued for several minutes, with much gesturing toward Margaret's family and consultation of what appeared to be a crude map drawn in the sand. When Joseph returned, his expression was troubled. "News from the north," he said. "Army patrol came through the main trading route 3 days ago, asking questions about a family traveling alone toward California." Margaret felt her stomach clench. What kind of questions? Description of a woman and 6 children, whether anyone had seen them, which direction they might have taken. Joseph studied her face carefully. "Is there something you haven't told me about why you left Missouri?" The moment Margaret had been dreading since accepting Joseph's guidance had finally arrived. She looked at her children, all of whom had stopped their exploration of the rock formations to listen to the adult conversation. "My husband's debts," she said finally, "more than I knew about when he died. The bank was going to take the farm, and there were other creditors, men who weren't interested in waiting for legal proceedings." Joseph's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he'd suspected as much. "How much debt?" $800, Margaret whispered, "plus interest that kept growing no matter how much I tried to pay." It was a fortune by frontier standards, more money than most families saw in several years. Sarah made a small sound of dismay. She'd known about their financial troubles, but not the full extent. "And these creditors," Joseph continued, "they Would send men to pursue a widow with children? Margaret nodded, unable to speak. The shame of their circumstances, combined with the fear she'd carried for months, finally broke through her careful composure. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying the distant mountains, where dust clouds might indicate pursuing riders or simply wind-blown sand. When he spoke, his voice carried a new note of urgency. "We change our route," he decided. "The main trail is too exposed, too predictable. We go deeper into the sacred country, places where white men rarely travel." "More dangerous?" Sarah asked. "Differently dangerous," Joseph corrected. "The desert can kill you, but it doesn't chase you for money you don't have." The Tohono O'odham. Travelers shared their midday meal with the small group, and Margaret found herself the subject of curious but not unfriendly attention from the women in the party. Despite the language barrier, they managed to communicate through gestures and the universal language of mothers caring for children. One woman, her hair streaked with premature grey and her hands bearing the calluses of hard work, examined Thomas with the practiced eye of someone experienced with childhood illnesses. She spoke rapidly to Joseph, who translated. "She says the boy's lungs are clearing well, but he needs more protein. Red meat, if possible." Joseph paused. "She also says you're wise to travel with a guide, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" "But she wonders why a scout who serves the army is helping people the army might be looking for." The question hung in the air between them, highlighting contradictions Margaret had been trying not to think about. Joseph worked for the government that might be facilitating their pursuit. His loyalty should be to the authorities seeking a woman who had fled legitimate debts. Instead of answering immediately, Joseph spoke again with the Tohono O'odham woman. Their conversation grew animated, with much pointing toward different directions and what appeared to be warnings about various routes. When the trading party finally departed, heading south toward the Mexican border, Joseph stood watching there, a dust trail until it disappeared around a distant rock formation. "You could have turned us in," Margaret said quietly. "Told them to send word to the army patrol." Joseph picked up his pack and checked the children's water supplies before responding. "My grandfather taught me that some laws come from the earth, and some laws come from men who never touched the earth. When they conflict, the earth usually knows better." As they resumed their climb toward the canyon rim, the conversation with the traders seemed to have crystallized something in Joseph's approach to their journey. His route choices became more complex, following paths that required intimate knowledge of the terrain, but offered concealment from anyone who might be tracking them from the main trails. The lessons he taught the children took on new urgency. Reading weather signs wasn't just useful knowledge. It might mean the difference between being caught in the open during a dangerous storm and finding shelter in time. Understanding animal behavior wasn't merely interesting. It could provide early warning of approaching riders or other human threats. But the most important lesson came as they finally reached the canyon rim in late afternoon. The view from their elevated position revealed the true scope of the landscape they'd been navigating. Canyons branched and twisted in every direction, creating a maze so complex that Margaret felt dizzy, trying to follow any single passage with her eyes. Mountains rose in the distance like purple promises, while closer ranges created barriers and shadows that constantly changed the character of the light. But most striking was what the elevated view revealed about their own journey. The path they'd followed looked impossible from above, a route that appeared to lead nowhere, doubling back on itself, disappearing into cliff faces only to emerge miles away in unexpected directions. "How do you remember all of this?" Rebecca asked, studying the bewildering terrain. Joseph pointed to a distinctive rock formation shaped like a crouching bear. "Navigation markers, each one connected to the next, like beads on a string. You learn to read the sequence, not just individual. Landmarks." He traced their route with his finger, showing how each day's travel had positioned them for the next stage, how apparent backtracking had actually been strategic movement toward goals invisible from ground level. "But now you see the problem," he continued, pointing towards several dust trails visible in the distance. "From up here, we can also see who else is moving through this country." Margaret shaded her eyes and studied the distant movements. 3 separate dust clouds, all following routes that would intersect with the main California trail within a day or 2 of travel. "Army patrols?" she asked. "1 certainly, maybe 2. The 3rd could be traders, or miners, or—" Joseph shrugged. "People like you running towards something or away from something." As evening approached and they made camp in a sheltered alcove well back from the exposed rim, Margaret found herself watching her children with new eyes. Emma played quietly with stones, creating elaborate patterns that seemed to mimic the canyon, formations they'd been studying. The twins worked together to prepare their evening meal, their movements coordinated by weeks of shared labor. David had begun carving his own figures, attempting to reproduce Joseph's patient technique with wood and knife. Thomas sat beside the fire, sketching the day's journey in a notebook Joseph had given him. His drawings combined careful observation with childish interpretation, creating maps that captured emotional truth as much as geographical accuracy. And Sarah, barely 16 but carrying responsibilities that would challenge an adult, moved between tasks with an efficiency that spoke of hard-won competence. "They're growing up fast," Margaret observed to Joseph as they sat by the dying fire. "The desert doesn't wait for childhood to end," he replied, "but it also doesn't waste anything, including innocence. Your children are learning to be strong without becoming hard." As if to illustrate his point, Emma approached them carrying her wooden horse, David's toy that she'd claimed as her own, and climbed into Margaret's lap with the easy trust of a child who felt completely safe despite being hundreds of miles from anything resembling civilization. That night, as Margaret lay listening to the soft breathing of her sleeping children, she realized they faced a choice more complex than simply reaching California. The desert was offering them a way of life, a set of relationships and skills and perspectives that had nothing to do with the conventional future she'd planned for them. But accepting that offer meant stepping even further away from the world that might still be pursuing them, into a landscape where the old rules didn't apply and new ones were still being written in stone and sand and starlight. Outside their shelter, coyotes called to each other across the canyons, their voices weaving together in harmonies that spoke of ancient freedoms and dangerous beauties. Margaret was only beginning to understand. The morning brought news that changed everything. Joseph returned from his dawn scouting with an expression Margaret had learned to recognize as trouble. He'd been checking their back trail, ensuring they hadn't been followed during their climb to the rim. What he'd found instead was evidence of a different kind of pursuit. 3 riders, he reported quietly, keeping his voice low so the children couldn't hear. "Professional trackers, not soldiers. They're following our old route from the sacred spring, but they're moving fast and reading sign better than most." Margaret felt her blood turn cold. "How do you know they're professional? Their horses are grain-fed, not desert ponies. Their camp last night was military precise, but without military equipment, and they're carrying enough supplies for extended pursuit." Joseph unfolded his geological survey map, pointing to various locations. Most telling, they didn't waste time exploring the wrong passages. Someone gave them very specific information about our route. But we changed direction, went deeper into the sacred country. 3 days ago. These men started tracking us 5 days ago. Joseph's finger traced a line on the map that intersected their current position. They know where we were, not where we are. But good trackers can predict where someone will go based on terrain, water sources, and weather patterns. Sarah approached with Emma on her hip, having heard enough of the conversation to understand they faced a new crisis. "How long do we have?" Joseph studied the map again, calculating distances and travel times. If they maintain their current pace and don't lose our trail at the rockfall, they'll reach the grandfather's stairway by tomorrow evening. Can we stay ahead of them? Margaret asked. Maybe, but not without taking risks that might be worse than capture. Joseph folded the map carefully. There's another option. We disappear completely. The twins had awakened and were listening with the intense attention they'd developed for adult conversations that might affect their survival. David sat beside Thomas, both boys instinctively moving closer to the adults when they sensed danger. What does that mean? Rebecca asked. Disappear. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying the children's faces with the careful assessment of someone weighing impossible choices. There are places in this desert where people can live for years without being found by anyone who doesn't know exactly where to look. Hidden valleys, secret springs, caves that connect to underground rivers. He paused. But once you enter that country, you don't come back to the white man's world easily. Margaret understood what he wasn't saying directly. They could vanish into the deep desert, become permanent refugees from their old lives. But such refuge came at the cost of everything they'd planned for their future. You're talking about giving up California, Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. Giving up Uncle James, the farm, everything we've been traveling toward. I'm talking about staying alive, Joseph replied simply. Your uncle's farm will still be there in a year or 2 years, but you won't be there to claim it if these trackers catch you. As if summoned by the conversation, the sound of distant horses drifted across the morning air. Too far away to represent immediate danger, but close enough to confirm that pursuit was real and closing. Joseph moved immediately into action, his military training evident in the efficiency of his commands. Pack only what you can carry easily. Leave anything that might slow us down. We're moving to higher ground where horses can't follow. The next hour passed in controlled chaos as the family abandoned everything except absolute necessities. Margaret watched months of careful planning disappear as they left behind tools, extra clothes and supplies that represented their entire investment in their future. But the children adapted with a resilience that continued to amaze her. Instead of lamenting what they were losing, they focused on what they needed to carry. Emma's needs were reduced to a single change of clothes and her wooden horse. Thomas insisted on keeping his notebook and pencil, declaring that their journey's record was more important than extra food. The twins worked together to distribute weight, ensuring that no one carried more than they could handle during extended travel. David surprised everyone by demonstrating skills they didn't know he'd acquired. Without being asked, he began disguising their campsite, scattering ashes from their fire and erasing footprints with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd been watching Joseph's techniques. Good work, Joseph approved, helping the boy complete the concealment. In 2 hours, this place will look like no one's been here for weeks. Their new route led through the country that challenged every assumption Margaret had formed about desert travel. Instead of following established passages, they climbed exposed cliff faces where a single misstep could prove fatal. Instead of seeking shelter during the day's heat, they traveled through hours when the sun turned rock surfaces too hot to touch with bare skin. But Joseph's knowledge of this extreme terrain proved as comprehensive as his understanding of the easier routes. He led them to handholds invisible until you knew where to look, to rest stops hidden in shadows that provided crucial relief from the brutal heat. Most remarkably, he showed them how to read the landscape's moods and respond accordingly. When thermal currents made climbing dangerous, they waited in whatever shelter they could find. When wind patterns indicated stable conditions, they moved with sustained urgency that covered enormous distances in surprisingly short time. The children rose to meet these demands with determination that spoke of weeks of gradual conditioning. Emma rode securely on Sarah's back, her small hands gripping her sister's shoulders with unconscious trust. The twins maintained their partnership, always ensuring that neither fell behind or became separated from the group. Thomas, despite his recent illness, climbed with careful persistence that often outlasted his healthier siblings. But the most significant change was in their relationship with Joseph himself. Over the days of shared danger and mutual dependence, the children had begun treating him not as a hired guide, but as a member of their family. They sought his approval for their efforts, brought him small discoveries from their explorations, and included him naturally in their conversations and games. Margaret watched this development with mixed emotions. Joseph's presence had undoubtedly saved their lives multiple times, and his knowledge continued to be essential for their survival, but she recognized that her children were forming attachments that might be difficult to maintain once they reached civilization. The question was, becoming whether they would ever reach civilization, or whether the desert would claim them so completely that the distinction became meaningless. On their second day of flight from the pursuing trackers, they encountered something that forced Margaret to confront this possibility directly. Hidden in a box canyon so narrow its entrance was nearly invisible from the outside, they discovered evidence of other refugees who had chosen the path Joseph was offering them. Ancient cliff dwellings, carefully maintained and clearly still in use. Garden plots that showed signs of recent cultivation, tool caches and water storage systems that spoke of permanent habitation. "Who lives here?" Sarah asked, studying the sophisticated adaptations that allowed human life to flourish in this impossibly remote location. "People who chose the desert over the alternatives," Joseph replied. "Some Apache who refused reservation life, some Mexican families fleeing revolution. Some Americans are running from various kinds of trouble." He led them to a specific dwelling where pictographs on the walls told stories in multiple artistic traditions. Apache symbols mingled with Mexican religious imagery and what appeared to be written messages in English. "My grandfather's sister came here 30 years ago, when the army was forcing people onto reservations," Joseph continued. "She raised 4 children in this canyon, taught them to live as free people. 2 of them still come here seasonally." Margaret studied the evidence of successful long-term survival in conditions she would have considered impossible just weeks earlier. Gardens that produced food in desert sand, water systems that captured and conserved every precious drop. Living spaces that provided comfort and security without any connection to the outside world. "It's beautiful," Thomas said, and Margaret realized with a start that he was right. The hidden canyon was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with conventional ideas about comfort or prosperity. It was the beauty of perfect adaptation, of human ingenuity, working in harmony with natural systems instead of fighting against them. But it was also the beauty of exile, of lives lived completely outside the society they'd been born into. As they made camp in one of the prepared shelters, Margaret found herself imagining what it would mean to stay here permanently. To raise her children in a place where they would never attend formal school, never participate in the social and economic systems that defined American life, never return to the world of farms and towns and churches that had shaped her own youth. Yet, as she watched her children explore their temporary refuge with growing excitement and confidence, she began to understand that this wasn't necessarily a sacrifice. It might be a different kind of education, producing different kinds of people, but not necessarily inferior ones. That evening, as they shared a meal prepared with vegetables from the canyon gardens and meat from game Joseph had taken with snares learned from his grandfather, Margaret realized that her family was being offered a choice she'd never imagined possible. They could disappear completely, becoming part of a hidden community that existed entirely outside the reach of creditors, law enforcement, and conventional society. They could raise their children to be citizens of the desert rather than citizens of America, teaching them skills and values that had nothing to do with debt and property and social expectations. But choosing that path meant accepting that they would never again be the people they had been, never again part of the world they had fled. As the stars emerged in the narrow strip of sky visible from the canyon floor, Margaret listened to her children's quiet conversations about the marvels they'd discovered in their temporary refuge. Their voices carried excitement and wonder, but also something deeper, a sense of belonging that they'd never expressed about any of the conventional destinations they'd been traveling toward. Tomorrow they would have to decide whether to continue their flight toward California or accept the desert's offer of permanent sanctuary. Either choice would transform them, but in fundamentally different ways. The pursuing trackers were still somewhere behind them, following a trail that led toward a family that no longer existed in any form they would recognize. The decision was made for them by Thomas. On their third morning in the hidden canyon, Margaret woke to find her youngest son burning with fever again, his small body shaking with chills, despite the desert heat already building outside their shelter. But this time was different. When she touched his forehead, his skin felt like fire, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that spoke of something far more serious than his previous illness. "Joseph!" she called urgently, not caring if she woke the other children. He appeared beside her immediately, his experienced hands checking Thomas's pulse, listening to his breathing, examining his eyes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen battlefield medicine. "Pneumonia," he said grimly, moving into his lungs fast. "What do we do?" Sarah asked. She'd awakened with the others and now knelt beside her little brother, her face pale with fear. Joseph was quiet for a moment, running through options in his mind. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of impossible choices. "He needs medicine we don't have here. Real medicine, from a doctor, or at least a trading post with proper supplies." He looked directly at Margaret. "The nearest source is Flagstaff, 4 days of hard travel north, or Tucson, 5 days southeast back the way we came. But the trackers are still out there, yes, probably closer than we'd like." Joseph checked Thomas's breathing again. "But without proper treatment, the boy won't survive the week." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. After everything they'd endured, all the dangers they'd survived, the growing skills and confidence her children had developed, Thomas might be lost to something as simple as lung infection. Emma, sensing the crisis without understanding it, began to cry. The twins moved instinctively to comfort her, but their own faces showed the fear they were trying to hide. David sat beside Thomas, holding his wooden horse close, as if it might provide some protection. "There's a third option," Joseph said quietly, "but it's the most dangerous of all." Margaret looked up from Thomas's flushed face. "Tell me, the army patrol that was asking about you, they're not just tracking, they're also providing medical support for surveying teams and Indian agents in this territory." Joseph unfolded his map, pointing to a location marked with careful annotations. "According to my last communication with the territorial office, there should be a field hospital at Willow Creek Station, about 2 days northeast of here. An army hospital," Sarah said slowly, "where they'd recognize us immediately." "Where they'd arrest Mother," Rebecca added, her voice small but clear about the implications. Joseph nodded gravely. "Almost certainly, but where they'd also save Thomas's life." The canyon fell silent, except for Thomas's labored breathing and the distant sound of wind through stone passages. Margaret found herself facing the choice she'd been avoiding since they'd first accepted Joseph's guidance, her freedom against her children's welfare. But before she could speak, David surprised everyone by standing up with sudden determination. "I'll go," he announced. "I'll take Thomas to the army hospital." "David, no," Sarah began. "I can do it." David insisted, his 9-year-old voice carrying conviction that belonged to someone much older. Joseph taught us to read the land, to find water, to follow the sun. I can get Thomas there. Margaret felt her heart break and swell simultaneously at her son's desperate courage, but Joseph spoke before she could respond. "You could make the journey," he said seriously, treating David's offer with the respect it deserved. "But the army wouldn't release Thomas to a child, even his brother. They'd hold him until adult family members came forward. Then I'll tell them Mother is dead," David replied immediately. "Tell them we're orphans, heading to relatives in California." The plan had obvious flaws, but Margaret found herself considering it with growing desperation. David had indeed learned remarkable skills during their desert travels. He might be able to reach the army station, might be able to convince them to treat Thomas, but Joseph was shaking his head. The risk isn't just to David and Thomas. If the army starts investigating the story of orphaned children, they'll send patrols to search for other family members or remains. They'll find us. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses echoed from the canyon's entrance. Not the distant noise they'd been hearing for days, but the immediate sound of riders entering their refuge. Joseph moved with silent efficiency, gesturing for absolute quiet while he positioned himself to observe the intruders. Margaret gathered the children into the deepest corner of their shelter, her heart hammering with the knowledge that discovery now meant not just capture, but potentially Thomas's death. The voices that drifted up from the canyon floor were American, speaking with the clipped precision of professional trackers discussing their quarry. "Trail goes cold here, but they didn't just disappear. Check every cave, every overhang, they're here somewhere. What about the kid? Orders said alive if possible. Sick kid's probably dead weight by now. But the woman's worth 800 plus bounty. That's enough to make this worthwhile." Margaret felt rage burn through her fear. These men spoke of Thomas as if he were already dead, of her children as obstacles to their profit. The protective fury she'd felt during their worst days in Missouri returned, stronger now and backed by weeks of survival skills she'd never imagined possessing. Joseph returned to their hiding place with grim news. 3 men, well-armed, systematic search pattern. They'll find us within the hour. "How?" Sarah whispered. "They're following horse tracks from my grandfather's sister's people. The canyon's been used recently enough to leave sign." Joseph checked his rifle, then looked directly at Margaret. "I can lead them away, give you time to escape with the children." "No," Margaret said immediately. "We stay together." "Mother," Sarah began. "We stay together," Margaret repeated with finality. "We've come too far and learned too much to scatter now." But Thomas's labored breathing reminded them all that staying together might mean watching him die, while they hid from men who represented the only chance of medical treatment within reach. The solution came from an unexpected source, Emma, who had been quietly playing with her wooden horse while the adults discussed impossible choices, suddenly pointed toward the back of their shelter and said clearly, "Water singing." Joseph looked where she pointed, then moved quickly to examine what appeared to be solid rock. His hands found purchase on stones that seemed naturally placed, but proved to be carefully fitted covers. "Hidden spring," he breathed. "Connected to the underground river system. Behind the concealed entrance lay a passage that angled downward into darkness, wide enough for people but too narrow for horses. The sound of running water echoed from somewhere far below. "Where does it lead?" Margaret asked. Joseph consulted his geological survey notes, cross-referencing cave systems and underground waterways. "If this connects to the main aquifer, it should emerge near Willow Creek, close enough to the army station to reach it quickly." "Through underground caves," Sarah said, understanding immediately, "where trackers can't follow, where we can't see dangers until we're on top of them," Joseph countered. Underground travel means flash flood risks, getting lost in passages that all look alike, running out of air in confined spaces. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by voices discussing search strategies. They had minutes, not hours, to decide. Thomas stirred in Margaret's arms, his fever-bright eyes focusing on her face with effort that cost him precious strength. "Ma," he whispered, "am I going to die?" The question, asked with the direct honesty children brought to ultimate concerns, crystallized Margaret's decision. "No," she said firmly. "You're going to get well, and we're all going to stay together. While you do it," she looked at Joseph, "how do we navigate underground passages?" "Carefully, following water flow toward the main outlet, marking our route so we don't get lost." He gathered his essential supplies, abandoning everything except navigation tools and emergency medical supplies. "But once we enter those caves, we're committed. No turning back if we encounter problems." The sound of boots on stone announced that the trackers had reached the upper levels of the canyon. Voices echoed off the walls as they began their systematic search of the cliff dwellings. One by one, the family slipped through the concealed entrance into the underground passage. Joseph went first, testing the route and air quality. Sarah followed with Emma, then the twins, then David, then Margaret carrying Thomas. Joseph sealed the entrance behind them, carefully replacing the stones so their escape route remained hidden. In the absolute darkness of the underground passage, they became completely dependent on Joseph's knowledge and their own developing trust in each other. The passage led downward through limestone formations carved by centuries of underground water flow. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, and the air carried the mineral smell of deep earth and flowing water. Thomas's condition worsened as they traveled. His breathing became more labored, and periods of consciousness alternated with feverish delirium. Margaret carried him against her chest, feeling his small heart racing with the effort of fighting infection his body couldn't defeat alone. But the underground route proved even more challenging than Joseph had predicted. Within hours, they encountered their first major obstacle, a chamber where the passage split into 4 different directions, each carrying the sound of flowing water, but with no clear indication of which led toward their destination. Joseph studied his geological notes by lamplight, trying to correlate underground features with surface landmarks. But his maps showed only theoretical connections between cave systems, not detailed navigation guides for underground travel. "We guess wrong here. We could wander in circles until our lamp oil runs out," he admitted. The children gathered around, the wavering light, their faces showing the strain of hours of careful travel through darkness. Emma had stopped talking, clinging to Sarah with the desperate quiet of a child pushed beyond her limits. The twins held hands so tightly their knuckles showed white in the lamplight. David stepped forward with the wooden horse he'd been carrying throughout their journey. "Thomas made me promise to take this to California," he said, "to Uncle James's farm." He placed the carved horse on the ground and spun it like a compass needle. When it stopped, it pointed toward the leftmost passage. "That's not scientific navigation," Sarah protested. "No," Joseph agreed, "but sometimes the heart knows directions the mind can't calculate." He studied the passage David's wooden horse had chosen, then checked it against what his instruments and experience suggested. Finally, he nodded. "The stone feels right. The air current suggests this connects to a larger system." He shouldered his pack. "We follow the horse." As they entered the new passage, Thomas began coughing again, deep, wet sounds that echoed horribly in the confined space. Each cough seemed to drain more of his diminishing strength, and Margaret found herself wondering if they were racing toward salvation or simply choosing a different way to watch her son die. Behind them, the sounds of the trackers searching the canyon grew fainter until they disappeared entirely. They had escaped immediate capture, but at the cost of venturing into an underground world where different dangers waited in every shadow. The passage ahead curved into darkness that their small lamp couldn't penetrate, carrying them toward an uncertain destination through a route that might lead to rescue or simply provide a hidden grave for a family that had already traveled too far from everything they used to call home. Hours passed in the underground maze, marked only by the steady sound of their footsteps on wet stone and Thomas's increasingly labored breathing. The passage David's wooden horse had chosen led steadily downward, following an underground stream that grew wider and more turbulent as they progressed. Margaret's arms ached from carrying Thomas, but she refused offers from Sarah and Joseph to take turns. Something primitive and maternal in her insisted that her dying child should remain in her arms, as if her touch alone might keep him anchored to life. The air in the tunnels grew thick and humid, carrying scents of minerals and deep earth that spoke of geological processes far beyond human understanding. Strange formations hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and pools of water reflected their lamplight in ways that created the illusion of vast spaces extending beyond their vision. But it was Emma who first noticed they were no longer alone. "Light," she whispered, pointing ahead into the tunnel. "Different light." Joseph immediately extinguished their lamp, plunging them into darkness so complete it felt solid. But Emma was right. Far ahead, a faint glow suggested either an exit or another source of illumination. "Could be natural light," Joseph murmured, "or it could be someone else down here." They advanced cautiously through the darkness, feeling their way along the tunnel walls. The glow grew stronger, resolving into what was definitely lamplight rather than sunlight filtering down from the surface. Voices echoed from the illuminated chamber ahead. Not English, but Spanish spoken in rapid, urgent tones. Joseph listened intently, then translated in whispers. "Mexican traders," he reported, "discussing route changes because of increased army patrols. They're using these tunnels to avoid detection while moving goods north." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Traders meant knowledge of routes, possibly medical supplies, certainly familiarity with underground travel that could guide them toward the surface. But Joseph's expression remained cautious. Could be legitimate merchants avoiding taxes and regulations. Could also be smugglers moving contraband that would make them dangerous to encounter. The decision was made for them when Thomas began another coughing fit, the sound echoing clearly through the stone passages. The Spanish voices stopped immediately, followed by the unmistakable sounds of men preparing for potential conflict. "¿Quién está ahí?" came a challenge from the lighted chamber. "Show yourselves!" Joseph stepped forward, his hands visible and empty, calling out in fluent Spanish that identified him as a government surveyor with a sick child needing help. The conversation that followed was rapid and complex, involving negotiations about identity, intentions, and mutual safety. Finally, Joseph gestured for the family to emerge into the light. The chamber they entered was larger than any they'd yet encountered, with multiple passages leading in different directions and evidence of regular use as a way station. 3 Mexican men examined them with the careful assessment of people accustomed to evaluating strangers quickly and accurately. But Margaret's attention focused immediately on their supplies: medical bags, carefully organized trade goods, and, most importantly, bottles that might contain the medicines Thomas desperately needed. The eldest of the 3 men, grey-bearded and wearing clothes that spoke of successful business dealings, approached Thomas with the confident manner of someone experienced with illness on the trail. "El niño está muy enfermo," he observed, checking Thomas's breathing and pulse. "Pneumonia, yes? Very dangerous without proper treatment." "You have medicine?" Margaret asked directly, not caring about diplomatic protocols. The man studied her, a face seeming to weigh factors beyond immediate medical needs. "Sí," We have what the boy needs, but medicine is valuable, and we are businessmen, not charity workers." "What do you want?" Joseph asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Information," the trader replied. "About army movements, patrol schedules, safe routes through the territories. You are a government surveyor, yes? You know these things?" Margaret felt her heart sink. Providing such information would make Joseph complicit in activities that might be considered treasonous, potentially ending his career and making him a fugitive like herself. But Thomas chose that moment to open his fever-bright eyes and whisper, "Ma, it hurts to breathe." The simple statement cut through all considerations of law and loyalty. Margaret looked directly at the trader. "Save my son's life, and we'll tell you whatever you want to know." The negotiation that followed revealed the complex realities of survival in territory where multiple authorities competed for control. The Mexican traders needed information about American military activities to avoid capture while moving goods between communities that depended on their services. Joseph needed medicine and safe passage for a family fleeing American law enforcement. Both sides had something the other required, but cooperation meant crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. The medicine the traders provided was real and effective. Within hours of receiving proper treatment, Thomas's breathing began to ease and his fever started to break. But the price of that medicine was Joseph's detailed knowledge of army patrol routes, supply schedules, and communication protocols. "This makes me a wanted man," Joseph told Margaret as they prepared to continue their underground journey. "Information I've provided could be used to ambush military units, raid supply convoys, or coordinate attacks on government installations." "Are you sorry?" she asked. Joseph looked at Thomas, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, then at the other children who had gathered around their recovering brother with expressions of profound relief. "No," he said simply. "Some choices are bigger than the rules that try to contain them. The Mexican traders provided more than medicine. They offered detailed knowledge of the underground route system, including a passage that emerged less than a mile from Willow Creek Station. More importantly, they offered an alternative destination. There is a settlement," the grey-bearded trader explained, sketching a rough map on the cave floor. 2 days northwest of here in the mountains, people who ask no questions about the past, who judge only by present actions. Families who chose freedom over law, community over country." "Another hidden refuge?" Sarah asked. "More than refuge. A place where children attend school, where adults practice trades, where life happens normally except outside the reach of governments that might disapprove." The trader smiled. "A place where a woman with 6 children and a scout with complicated loyalties could build a future without looking over their shoulders." Margaret studied the crude map, trying to understand what was being offered. Not just escape from immediate pursuit, but entry into a community of people who had chosen exile, over compliance with laws they couldn't accept. "Who lives there?" she asked. "Former slaves who refused to remain sharecroppers, Mexicans displaced by territorial changes, Indians who wouldn't accept reservation, Americans running from various forms of justice or injustice." The trader's gesture encompassed infinite possibilities. People who discovered that freedom means choosing your own definition of home. As they prepared to leave the trader's way station, Margaret found herself considering 2 different futures for her family. They could still attempt to reach Uncle James's farm in California, claiming the conventional life she'd planned for them. Or they could accept this invitation to join a community that existed entirely outside conventional American society. The underground route toward Willow Creek would put them within reach of both destinations. But it would also test their survival. Skills one final time, leading them through passages that required technical climbing, underwater swimming, and navigation through chambers where poisonous gases could accumulate. The most dangerous part comes last, Joseph warned, as they shouldered their packs and prepared to leave the relative safety of the way station. The final passage to the surface involves climbing through a chimney formation where rock falls are common. "We'll be completely exposed and vulnerable during the ascent." The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications. Then Rebecca spoke for both of them. "We've gotten this far by trusting each other. We don't stop now." David nodded agreement, still carrying his wooden horse, but now also bearing one of the navigation tools Joseph had taught him to use. "Besides," he added with 9-year-old logic, "we already know we can do impossible things." Emma, restored to her normal, cheerful energy, by the relief of Thomas's recovery, clapped her hands and announced, "Adventure!" with the enthusiasm of someone too young to fully understand danger. Even Thomas, though still weak from his illness, managed a smile that spoke of determination inherited from parents who had crossed half a continent in pursuit of a dream. As they entered the final section of underground passage, following the traders' directions toward a surface exit that might deliver them to freedom or capture, Margaret realized that her family had already achieved something more valuable than reaching any specific destination. They had learned to trust themselves, each other, and the knowledge that survival often required choices between competing loyalties. Whether they emerged into the custody of army trackers or the freedom of an open country, they would face that future as people who had discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. The passage ahead led upward through stone formations that tested every climbing skill they'd acquired during their desert travels, but it also led toward resolution of the questions that had driven them from their Missouri farm into the vast uncertainties of the American West. Behind them, the sound of flowing water continued its ancient song, carrying away all trace of their passage through the hidden world beneath the desert. Ahead, whatever form of light awaited them at the surface, they would meet it together, transformed by their journey into people their former selves would barely recognize. They emerged from the underground passages into a world transformed by their absence. The exit cave opened onto a high mountain meadow where wildflowers painted the landscape in colors that seemed impossible after weeks of red desert stone. Pine trees provided shade that felt like a blessing, and a stream ran clear and cold through grass that invited barefoot walking. But most startling of all were the people waiting for them. 3 women and 2 men sat around a small fire as if their arrival had been expected rather than hoped for. Their clothes spoke of practical frontier life, but their faces carried the calm confidence of people who had found their place in the world and weren't interested in apologizing for it. The eldest woman rose to greet them, her silver hair braided, with ribbons that caught the morning light. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "You're the family the traders told us about," she said without preamble. Woman with 6 children, traveling with the scout who chose conscience over orders. Margaret found herself too exhausted for diplomatic conversation. "We're looking for sanctuary," she said directly. "My children need safety, education, a chance to grow up without running." "And you?" the woman asked. "What do you need?" The question caught Margaret off guard. For months her own needs had been entirely subordinated to her children's survival. The idea that she might want something for herself seemed both foreign and dangerous. "I need to stop being afraid," she answered honestly. The woman smiled, and something in her expression reminded Margaret of her own mother. "I'm Helena Martinez. This settlement was my idea 15 years ago, when my husband and I decided that raising children in freedom mattered more than raising them in comfort." She gestured toward the others around the fire. Samuel, there was a Union soldier who couldn't stomach Reconstruction politics. Maria fled the Mexican Revolution. Jacob and Ruth lost their farm to railroad companies who decided their legal ownership didn't matter. Each person she indicated nodded acknowledgement, but didn't elaborate on their stories. Margaret sensed that past troubles weren't discussed extensively here. What mattered was present contribution to the community's welfare. "How many people live here?" Sarah asked, studying the meadow for signs of permanent settlement. 43. Adults, 31 children, Helena replied. "Large enough to be self-sufficient, small enough that everyone knows everyone. We farm, raise livestock, maintain crafts that support trade with sympathetic merchants. The children receive education that prepares them for life in any world they might choose to enter." Joseph had been studying the defensive positions around the meadow with professional interest. "You've thought about security," he observed. Samuel, the former Union soldier, joined the conversation. Multiple escape routes, early warning systems, defensive positions that could hold off significant force if necessary. But mostly, we rely on being invisible to people who don't need to find us. "The traders mentioned army patrols," Margaret said. "How do you avoid detection?" "By being exactly what we appear to be," Maria answered. "A small farming community in difficult country, growing food and raising children like hundreds of other settlements throughout the territories. Nothing unusual, nothing that attracts attention from authorities with other priorities." Helena led them toward the main settlement, which proved to be larger and more sophisticated than Margaret had expected. Log cabins arranged around a central square, workshops for various crafts, gardens that spoke of careful agricultural planning. Most impressive was the school building, larger than the church and equipped with books, maps, and scientific instruments that rivaled any institution Margaret had known. "Education is our primary investment," Helena explained, noting Margaret's interest. "Children who grow up here need skills that allow them to succeed in conventional society if they choose it, or to build alternative communities if they prefer that path." The teacher who emerged from the school building surprised Margaret even more than the institution itself. A young black woman whose dignified bearing and precise speech spoke of advanced education. She greeted them with the easy confidence of someone whose intellectual authority was unquestioned. "Dr. Catherine Williams," she introduced herself, "graduated from Oberlin College, taught in Boston, until I decided that real education required more freedom than conventional institutions could provide." Thomas, fully recovered from his pneumonia, but still weak from the ordeal, studied the school building with growing excitement. "Do you teach about rocks and water and animal tracks?" he asked. "We teach about everything the world offers," Dr. Williams replied seriously. "Geology, biology, mathematics, literature, history, philosophy. But we also teach practical skills. Farming, carpentry, metalworking, healing arts, education that prepares students for whatever life they choose to build." The twins had wandered toward a group of children playing elaborate games that seemed to combine elements of several cultures. Their ready acceptance into the group spoke of a community that valued inclusion over conformity. David, meanwhile, had discovered a workshop where a craftsman was creating furniture with tools and techniques that fascinated him. Emma found herself immediately adopted by a group of women who seemed delighted to have a toddler to spoil. As the day progressed, Margaret began to understand that this settlement represented something unprecedented in her experience, a community that had consciously chosen to exist outside conventional American society while maintaining all the benefits of civilization. That truly mattered. But the afternoon brought visitors that tested the community's carefully maintained invisibility. A dust cloud on the eastern approach announced riders moving fast toward the settlement. Helena and Samuel moved immediately to alert positions while maintaining the appearance of normal farm activity. Children continued playing, adults continued working, but Margaret sensed the instant transformation from relaxed community to defensive unit. The riders proved to be a familiar threat, the three professional trackers who had pursued them through the desert canyons. But their horses showed signs of hard travel, and the men themselves appeared frustrated rather than confident. From her concealed position behind the school building, Margaret could hear their conversation with Helena, who met them at the settlements, edge with the polite wariness of a frontier housewife dealing with unexpected visitors. "We're looking for a woman and 6 children," the lead tracker announced. "Federal fugitives, wanted for debt default and illegal flight to avoid prosecution." "Lot of families travel through this country," Helena replied neutrally. "Most headed, and toward California or Oregon. What makes you think they'd stop here?" "Trail signs suggest they had help from someone with extensive local knowledge. Government scout probably, gone rogue." The tracker's voice carried suspicion and exhaustion. "You see anyone like that recently?" "Only visitors we've had lately were Mexican traders heading south, but you're welcome to rest your horses, get some water." Helena's offer sounded genuinely hospitable while revealing nothing useful. Margaret watched the exchange with growing tension, recognizing that her presence endangered everyone in the settlement. The community had offered sanctuary, but accepting it meant involving innocent people in her flight from justice. Joseph appeared beside her, having moved through the settlement's concealed pathways to reach her position undetected. "They'll search. If they suspect anything," he whispered. "Professional trackers don't give up easily." "I should surrender," Margaret whispered back. "Tell them the children are orphans. Let them place the kids with relatives. It would end this pursuit and destroy your family," Joseph replied firmly. "Your children have grown strong during this journey, but they're not ready to survive conventional society without you." The tracker's search proved cursory. They examined the main buildings, asked a few questions, but failed to discover the concealed shelters and hidden pathways that allowed the settlement's residents to disappear when necessary. But as they prepared to leave, the lead tracker made an announcement that changed everything. "Federal marshals will be through this territory next week," he called out to Helena, "setting up checkpoints, inspecting all settlements, looking for fugitives and contraband. You might want to make sure your paperwork is in order." The implication was clear. Their temporary safety was about to be thoroughly compromised. Whatever decision Margaret made about her family's future needed to happen immediately. That evening, the settlement's adults gathered for the kind of community meeting that had probably determined every major decision in their 15 years of existence. Margaret found herself at the center of discussions about risks, resources, and responsibilities that went far beyond her own family's welfare. "Federal checkpoints changed the situation for everyone," Samuel observed. "Our invisibility depends on being too insignificant to investigate thoroughly. But if we help this family disappear completely, we maintain that invisibility," Dr. Williams countered. "The trackers go away satisfied they lost the trail. Federal marshals find nothing suspicious when they inspect us." "How do we disappear? Completely?" Sarah asked. Speaking for the first time since the tracker's visit, Helena unfolded a map that showed routes through mountain country Margaret hadn't known existed. Northern passage to British Columbia, southern route to Mexico, western trail to California, communities that don't ask questions about background. "Or," she added, pointing to the settlement itself, "you become permanent residents here. New identities, integration into the community, a life that exists entirely outside federal jurisdiction." The choice Margaret had been avoiding since they'd first entered the canyons could no longer be postponed. Conventional life in California, with the constant risk of discovery and arrest, or permanent exile from American society, raising her children in a community that had chosen freedom over law. But the decision wasn't hers alone anymore. "What do you want?" she asked her children, using the same directness Helena had shown when asking about her own needs. Thomas spoke first, surprising everyone with his clarity. "I want to learn about everything. rocks and water and how plants grow and why stars move the way they do, and I want to learn it from Dr. Williams." The twins exchanged their wordless communication. Then Rebecca answered for both. "We want to belong somewhere, really belong, not just be allowed to stay." David held up his wooden horse, now worn smooth by weeks of handling. "I want to learn to make things like this, but better. And I want to teach other kids to carve too." Emma, understanding more than anyone had realized, pointed toward the group of children who had adopted her. "Friends," she said simply. Only Sarah hesitated, and Margaret understood why. At 16, her eldest daughter was old enough to comprehend what they were choosing between: conventional society with its opportunities for marriage, career, social advancement, versus exile in a community that might limit her future possibilities. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Williams said," Sarah finally announced, "about education that prepares you for whatever life you choose to build. I want that kind of education. And I want to help other people get it too." Margaret looked at Joseph, who had remained silent throughout the family discussion. "And you?" "I made my choice when I helped Thomas get medicine," he replied. "I'm already a wanted man, but I'm also a man who knows how to read the landscape, how to survive in country that challenges everyone who enters it. This community could use that knowledge." The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Not just Margaret's family choosing exile, but the settlement choosing to accept them permanently, despite the risks involved. But the morning brought one final test of their resolution. Federal marshals arrived at dawn, not the expected patrol, but an advanced scouting party investigating reports of unusual activity in the mountain territories. Their leader carried credentials that demanded cooperation and documents that threatened serious consequences for anyone harboring fugitives. Margaret watched from concealment as Helena met the marshals with the same polite wariness she'd shown. The trackers. But this time the questions were more specific, the searches more thorough, the threats more explicit. "We have reliable reports of a government scout gone rogue," the marshal announced. "Man named Joseph Running Bear, providing aid to federal fugitives. You see anyone matching that description, you're legally obligated to report it immediately." Helena's response would determine not just Margaret's family's fate, but the entire community's future relationship with federal authority. What she said would either preserve their carefully maintained invisibility or expose them all to investigation that could destroy everything they'd built. Margaret closed her eyes and waited for Helena's answer. Knowing that it would determine whether her children's journey toward freedom had finally found its destination or would continue into uncertainties she couldn't imagine. Helena Martinez looked the federal marshal directly in the eye and spoke, with the calm authority of someone who had faced harder choices than this one. "Joseph Running Bear stopped here 3 weeks ago," she said evenly. "Government surveyor traveling alone, heading northwest toward the territorial capital. Stayed one night, shared a meal, moved on. Professional man doing his job." The marshal studied her face, searching for deception. "You're certain he was alone?" "Absolutely certain. My husband Samuel there spoke with him extensively about geological formations in the area." Helena gestured toward the former Union soldier, who nodded confirmation. Man knew his business, but he wasn't running from anything. Just completing his surveying work before winter weather made travel impossible. Margaret held her breath. Recognizing that Helena had chosen truth over safety, Joseph had indeed passed through the settlement before, during his legitimate surveying work. The marshal was receiving accurate information that concealed everything that mattered. "And you've seen no family groups? Women with children traveling without proper documentation?" "Plenty of families pass through, heading toward California or Oregon. Most don't stop long enough for detailed conversation." Helena's shrug encompassed the realities of frontier hospitality. We offer water, basic supplies, directions if asked. People appreciate help, but they don't usually share their personal business. The marshal spent another hour investigating the settlement, examining buildings and questioning residents. But the community's practiced invisibility held. Hidden rooms remained undetected, concealed pathways stayed secret, and every adult provided consistent stories about normal farming operations and routine activities. When the federal party finally departed, riding north toward more conventional settlements, Margaret felt the profound relief of someone who had expected to die but discovered she would live. But the real transformation began in the days that followed. Within a week, Margaret found herself teaching reading and writing to adults in the settlement who had never received formal education. Her years of helping her own children with schoolwork had prepared her for this role in ways she'd never expected. More surprisingly, she discovered a talent for making complex ideas accessible to people who brought different kinds of intelligence to their learning. Sarah threw herself into advanced studies with Dr. Williams, devouring books on subjects ranging from medicine to law to agricultural science. But she also began teaching younger children, developing skills that combined academic knowledge with the practical wisdom she'd acquired during their desert travels. The twins found their calling in the settlement's workshops, where their coordination and shared intuition made them exceptional partners in projects requiring precise teamwork. They learned furniture making, textile production, and food preservation with the same intensity they'd once applied to surviving in the canyons. David's carving skills evolved rapidly under the guidance of master craftsmen who recognized his natural talent. Within months, his wooden figures became treasured throughout the settlement, capturing not just physical likeness, but emotional truth about the people and animals he observed. Thomas proved to be a natural scientist, asking questions that challenged even Dr. Williams's extensive knowledge. His notebooks were filled with observations about plant growth, weather patterns, and animal behavior that contributed genuine value to the settlement's understanding of their environment. Emma, now 4 years old and completely comfortable in her new home, moved through the community like a small ambassador, equally at ease with elderly residents and teenage children. Her easy acceptance of diversity helped other newcomers integrate more quickly. Joseph's integration proved more complex, but equally successful. His geographical knowledge helped the settlement identify new water sources, better defensive positions, and trade routes that reduced their dependence on external suppliers. But more importantly, his ability to bridge different cultural perspectives made him invaluable in resolving conflicts and maintaining community harmony. 6 months after their arrival, Margaret realized that her children had become different people than she'd ever imagined they could be. Not different in ways that diminished them, but different in ways that revealed capabilities she'd never known they possessed. The settlement itself evolved to accommodate their presence. The school expanded its curriculum to include advanced geological studies, inspired by Thomas's questions and Joseph's expertise. The workshops developed new products influenced by design ideas the family brought from their previous life. The farming operations improved through Sarah's research into crop rotation and soil management. But the most significant change was in the community's relationship with the outside world. Word of the settlement's success began attracting other families seeking alternatives to conventional society. A steady stream of visitors arrived throughout the summer, some staying only briefly before continuing to other destinations, others choosing to request permanent residence. Each new arrival brought different skills, perspectives, and challenges. Margaret found herself serving on the council that evaluated potential residents, helping to determine who could contribute to the community's welfare and who might disrupt its carefully maintained harmony. The role suited her in ways she hadn't expected. Years of managing 6 children had developed skills in reading people's character, mediating disputes, and making decisions that balanced individual needs against collective welfare. The settlement benefited from her practical wisdom, while she discovered capabilities that had been dormant during her years as a conventional frontier wife. By autumn, the community had grown to over 90 residents, requiring new organizational structures and expanded facilities. Margaret spearheaded the construction of a larger school building, while Sarah designed a curriculum that prepared students for life in either conventional or alternative society. The twins coordinated workshop expansions that increased the settlement's capacity for producing trade goods, while David established an apprenticeship program that taught carving skills to children throughout the community. Thomas's scientific observations led to the discovery of mineral deposits that could support small-scale mining operations, providing additional economic security. Emma, now speaking fluently in 3 languages learned from the settlement's diverse residents, served as translator and cultural bridge for new arrivals. Joseph's most important contribution proved to be establishing relationships with other hidden communities throughout the Western Territories. His travels revealed a network of settlements similar to theirs, creating opportunities for trade, communication, and mutual support that increased everyone's security and prosperity. The first winter tested their commitment in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Isolation became complete when snow blocked mountain passes, forcing the community to rely entirely on its own resources. But instead of creating hardship, the isolation fostered deeper relationships and collaborative projects that strengthened their bonds. Margaret spent long evenings by firelight, listening to stories from residents whose backgrounds spanned continents and cultures. Former slaves shared songs and healing traditions. Mexican refugees contributed recipes and agricultural techniques. European immigrants offered crafting skills and educational methods. Her children absorbed this cultural wealth, with the adaptability that had carried them through their desert ordeal. By spring, they spoke multiple languages, understood diverse religious traditions, and possessed practical skills that would serve them in any environment they might encounter. But the true measure of their transformation came when federal authorities made one final attempt to locate the fugitives who had disappeared into the canyons. A new team of investigators arrived in late spring, carrying updated descriptions and more sophisticated tracking methods. But the people they sought no longer existed in any form they would recognize. Margaret Whitmore had become Helena Rodriguez, a Mexican widow who had remarried and integrated seamlessly into a farming community that bore no resemblance to the family group that had fled Missouri. Her children had assumed new identities that reflected their transformed circumstances and capabilities. When the investigators questioned community residents about fugitive families, they received truthful answers about the absence of anyone matching their descriptions. The people they sought had indeed vanished completely, replaced by new individuals who belonged fully to their chosen community. As summer returned to the mountain meadow, Margaret stood, watching her children play with friends whose backgrounds spanned the hemisphere. Thomas had grown tall and confident, his scientific notebooks earning respect from adults throughout the settlement. Sarah had become Dr. Williams's research partner, developing educational methods that were attracting attention from progressive educators in distant cities. The twins had established their own workshop, producing furniture and textiles that commanded premium prices from traders who appreciated quality craftsmanship. David's carvings had become so sophisticated that art collectors in Denver and San Francisco specifically requested his work. Emma, now 5 and completely bilingual, served as unofficial greeter for new arrivals, her easy confidence helping nervous families feel welcome in their new home. Joseph had become the settlement's primary liaison with the outside world, his knowledge of both conventional and alternative societies making him invaluable in maintaining the relationships that kept the community safe and prosperous. That evening, as the family gathered for their weekly dinner together, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate flight to peaceful belonging. The canyon maze that had threatened to trap them forever had instead led them to a freedom they'd never imagined possible. "Do you ever miss the old life?" she asked her children, curious about their perspective on the transformation they'd all undergone. "Which old life?" Thomas replied, looking up from the geological samples he'd been examining. "The one where we were afraid all the time, or the one where we didn't know what we could become?" His answer captured something essential about their experience. They hadn't simply escaped their problems. They'd discovered possibilities that conventional society would never have offered them. As stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had found her true home after wandering through landscapes she'd never expected to navigate. The desert had tested them, but it had also taught them that survival meant more than simply staying alive. It meant choosing who you wanted to become and having the courage to transform yourself into someone worthy of the life you'd chosen to claim. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.